everyone, and welcome to the DRW show. I'm going to coin that term officially. I'm Deanna Williams, and I am the personal brand of Deanna Reese Williams. And today we have Seraph. And ironically, we did not meet through the Summer Institute. I know that's pretty shocking because everyone so far we have met through Summer Institute, I believe. But Seraph and I actually met this summer through the Green Schoolyards movement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as this interview goes on. But her and I met through a Zoom call, okay? And so there's some different connecting pieces, and how I feel like we're even more connected, and not just through environmental ed or Green Schoolyards, but just different parts of our lives kind of intersect. So Seraph, welcome to the DRW show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so great to be here.
So could you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into environmental ed?
Yeah, so I was really lucky enough to grow up camping with my family. I grew up in San Francisco, and my mom's family was in Denver. So every summer we would do these long road trips across the American West. And I don't know, there's just when you have those early experiences, the American West especially just sort of finds a way to embed itself in your heart. And so I continued doing that with my family, and later on through school and college programs, and then as a mother myself, have continued the tradition of long road trips. With my kids, we visited, I think, over 30 national parks at this point. Yeah.
Wow. That's impressive. That's really impressive. So now I have to ask, which one is your favorite? What's like your top 3 favorite national parks?
Yep.
Uh-oh. Are you frozen? Are you still there?
I am. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay.
What happened? Okay. You there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so 30 national parks at least.
Wow. So out of 30, what would be your top 3, like either favorite or people have to go see? Like if you could give a recommendation.
Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that what's really amazing about the national park system is that each of them are so distinct, and they have such a unique geological history, such a unique sort of botanical experience. The plants and animals, the ecology is so distinct. Like each national park really becomes sort of like the most sort of fulfilled or extreme version of the local surrounding ecological situation. So, the Grand Canyon, for instance, there are lots of canyons in the desert, but the Grand Canyon kind of takes it to a whole nother level in terms of its immensity. And so, what I would say, like narrowing it down to 3, that's a little bit challenging because each park kind of feeds a different part of your soul. And meets different people in different ways too. So, I top 3 national parks. There just are so many stories. It's hard to not like go into
or what about like which ones fed you the most?
Yeah.
That might be a way of asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that so there's the ones that are just sort of local in my backyard, being from San Francisco. So there's just something about the High Sierra that Yosemite and Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Park all you know, all hold when you get up to, you know, to 10,000 feet, and you're, you know, and the tree line is just kind of right there, and you have these huge granite domes and peaks, and, you know, with all the glacial changes that have happened to them, and the air is crisp in a certain way, and it just, you know, there's just that feeling, you know, of being up there. For me, one of my personal favorites is the Mojave National Preserve. I just love the Mojave Desert, and, you know, the plants that are there, especially the creosote bushes and the Joshua trees and the barrel cactuses, and the, you know, it just, the night sky, and just the smell of the crispness. Even when it's hot, there's like a sharpness in the air that just makes my whole body feel good.
Right.
So we're still in California, because there's a lot actually in California. And then, you know, you go to the other extreme to Redwoods National Park, which is in the northern part of California. And, you know, you have just these amazing trees, and it's this interesting sort of state park, national park intersection. So a lot of the campgrounds are on the state parks, and the national parks are, I think, a few different groupings of land. And it's just, you know, here you have these tall trees, and the moistness from the fog, and the denseness of the underfoliage, and it's green and red and rich, and sort of that humusy earth quality that you really only get in redwood forests. And you know,
Yes.
to just paint a local picture for being from San Francisco.
Wow. That was like the one national park that my husband and I went to when we went to San Francisco,
Redwoods.
the Redwoods. And that wasn't long enough because, of course, we did the standard like day tourist type of trip because we only had one day to really explore. But we've always said, like, if we have the opportunity to go back, like, I could totally hang out in that forest for a few days if you let me, you know?
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
You know, I mean, I think though that one thing that like I do with my kids, speaking of the day tours, is, you know, and this is me as just a parent who is an outdoors enthusiast, but also, you know, both a history nut and really committed to teaching my children to not just see what our, you know, what oftentimes is a white supremacist colonizing culture presents to them. So when we go into the visitor centers, who is being left out of the story? Who's not being left out of the story? You know, like oftentimes the national parks are where, you know, they're these abundant, beautiful spaces which indigenous folks were actually kicked out of in order to make it a parkland. And so to make, you know, so it's always a history lesson, like how are people being included, and how are people being just erased entirely? How much are folks a historical anomaly as opposed to, you know, people who are still presently in relationship? And I think that, you know, one of the best experiences I had that way was in South Dakota. We had camped the night before at Badlands National Park, which is just stunning, you know, and overlooks Pine Ridge Reservation. And, you know, and then we went, and this was in the middle of Sturgis, the Sturgis motorcycle thing. So just kind of crazy. Then we went past Mount Rushmore because we were there, which was sort of, you know, horrifyingly racist, honestly, in the way that they were presenting a lot of our, you know, national diversity and the history of the area, of course, because, you know, the Black Hills are sacred land to the Lakota people. And then we ended up at Wind Cave National Park. And what I loved about Wind Cave National Park, aside from that, after days of motorcycles, it was really quiet because it's kind of an out of the way park.
Right.
It was, you know, and it was just these beautiful hills going into sort of grasslands, and they're doing all this rehabilitation work around the grasses and the buffalo, and it's really kind of exciting, the biology that they're doing. But we got to the mouth of Wind Cave, and right there was a big sign acknowledging the 5 Lakota tribes that still treat Wind Cave as a sacred spot. And there were also the prayer bundles from a recent ceremony. And so I love that. And I hope that as we continue all these conversations as a country about diversity and inclusion, that more and more national parks include those pictures, because it's not like those moments, because it's not about erasing humans from nature. It's really about making sure that we're honoring our connection and community with the natural world in all of the sort of good traditional ways that we have. And so I really appreciated that about Wind Cave.
Wow. So one of the many reasons why I definitely wanted to take a moment and say, Seraph, would you be willing to do a DRW interview? And you saying yes, it means a lot to me, but it's just this very conversation and what you're talking about with the national parks. There's so much that I've learned in just our conversations in the last, 3 months, and making me go back and doing some more history lessons myself. I'm really working on trying to do a better job of doing land acknowledgement, like where am I at? I've at least established, and ironically, at the college that I work at, we have to take like culture and history and language courses. So I at least knew that the Tohono were on these actual lands that I live on. And I thought that was really impressive to know that. So the fact that they're no longer in the Cochise County area, but they're in the Pima County. And they were formerly known, I don't want to say formally, but also known as the Papago people as well. But my point is that there are so many times when I show up into like an environmental education room, and when people say we want to do land acknowledgements, like the level of like how uncomfortable people feel about that. And it's not so much like, it's more than just like not feeling comfortable, but not even knowing where to start.
Yep.
Or what is the purpose of doing it? And part of what it really reminds me of when I think about like my dad and where he grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. And one of the things I'll never forget, like him owning a piece of property on the very street that he grew up on. It's important because the city really wants to take over that street, actually wants to take over the two very streets. But it made me think, if people from the neighborhood don't buy up this property, then it's almost as if they never lived there. You know what I'm saying? And so that was my way of like really connecting that and really understanding the significance of it. Like it just, it's like, wow, it is really important to have that. And especially as a Black woman who lives in Southern Arizona, I'm not from Southern Arizona, but I'm a military kid that was born in Vegas. There's not really, so my connection is really whatever connection my parents have. And that's how I stay connected to where I'm from. And then I take it even further and it's like, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Jamaican, like this is who I am. But I also think working at a tribal college where it is ingrained within the culture to hold on to who you are, but most importantly, know who you are. And I don't know. So by the time you and I crossed paths, it was, I don't know, timing was everything, because it's made me like really try to take the time to get those stories, whether it's from my aunts or my uncles or my parents. And it's in whatever, if it's a phone conversation or an email or a text message, it's one of those things where I'm like, it is so important to capture that history, because if you don't document it, then it's like it never happened, you know. And I'm thankful that I had a dad that took pictures of everything. If I want to know what happened 20 years ago, I guarantee there's a picture. So before there were like phones, maybe I should say 30 years ago, before there were phones, like he always documented everything. And so I just find it really powerful. Like I felt like just helping me understand the importance of acknowledgement and why it is such a big deal. But how do we change that narrative when people feel so uncomfortable? Because we've seen this happen in the work that we're doing with the green schoolyards.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to acknowledge just right now that I am born and raised and continue to live on the traditional land of the alumnae, in what we call San Francisco, which has its own, you know, steep history of genocide, erasure, resettlement challenges, not just for indigenous folks through starting with the mission systems and then, heading towards, vigilante militias once California became the United States, and then all the history of non-recognition, especially here on the coastal areas. There was a lot of non-recognition that happened for the local tribes, so meant they didn't get the resources and support, as minimal as that sometimes can be, as other tribes around the country. But also, just while I'm sitting here, want to acknowledge the that San Francisco is also where there's been a lot of challenges around the the challenges is such a euphemism for just really the treatment of the Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans for 150 years, from being barred to being not full citizens to being in semi-slavery, because you don't call it slavery and you don't enshrine it in law, which is of course its own horrible experience in California, which was never a slave state, when the railroads were going up, and there was definitely a de facto, a lot of de facto slavery, etc., of especially Chinese Americans, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act, and just tremendous amounts of racism, and then also in the West, the internment during World War II of the Japanese Americans, that we can feel in the land, that disrupted land ownership here. And one of the national monuments that we've been to is Manzanar, which is one of the internment camps in what's called Owens Valley. So, and then of course our very long history with the Latinx community here in California, from early on in California sort of history to today, how that whole community and the diversity of that community is treated, and in some cases very, very, very poorly. So just to acknowledge all of that, and I think that part of this acknowledgement is that the land feels that, the land feels that even the way it makes me think about the going into the sequoia forests in the mountains, and there's a history of burning there that happens, and you can see it when you hike through the big sequoia groves. You can see the fires that are 1,000 years ago and the fires that are 500 years ago, because of the marks that they left on the trees. Walking through the trees, you're really walking through 2,000 years of history of forest management. And and in this state, the many of the native folks who had been participating in and managing the land through controlled burns and all of these other things that we now know are important, were there was genocide, resettlement, et cetera, and then Smokey the Bear came along and suppressed all the fires, and you can see that on the landscape too. Because there's 70 years where 100 years where the sequoia weren't able to germinate, because sequoia actually requires fire to germinate. So just all of these things that you see on the landscape. So when I think the first thing to start with land acknowledgement is, it's not some some story that we get to say whether or not it's present. It's really, are we willing to look in the face of the story that's in front of us? You know,
Yes.
if that makes sense. And I think so. You talk about discomfort, and I mean, that's like kind of the American story, right? Like, you know, you look, you know, we're talking about originalism in the Constitution. Well, originalism has, you know, not to put it bluntly, you being 3/5 of a person.
Right.
You know, like, so like, do I like pretend that that's not there because, oh, it makes me uncomfortable to be that straight about that that's like what's originally in the Constitution? Like, no, if
Right.
we're just pretending, then we're pretending, and you can't go deep, and you can't have authentic conversation, and you certainly can't have the healing that we all need to move past that sort of original sin of what our country is founded on. You
Right.
know, so it's the same thing. Like, it's there in the landscape. There's, you know, it's there, it's literally there in the landscape,
Yep.
and you know, and you know, so to not, sure, we can cover our eyes, and sure, it hurts when we uncover them because it's painful, it's ugly, it's horrible. I you know, I don't know, that's never been a reason to like cover my eyes back up again. Like, there, I guess another way to put it is that like there are people who don't have the privilege to cover their eyes back up. So why should my discomfort, which is so minor compared to, you know, any of the events that I've just described, why should my discomfort allow me to disqualify myself from that conversation?
Right. This, you know, I wanted to reach out to you. Look, I'm like, wait a minute. We just had a holiday, a federal holiday this past Monday, right?
Yep.
And you know, you're fully aware that I'm at a tribal college. We don't even, there's no acknowledgement that this day even exists on the calendar at the college, which is totally fine. But because we have offered free tuition to all Native American students or to all Native Americans, I had some very interesting questions come through last Monday.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And it was like, do we still have class today? So I was kind of caught in a really weird space because I'm going, well, the college does not, like, it's not even acknowledged as a holiday. There's nothing, it's just another regular day. But what do you do when you've got students in the state of Arizona where at times I feel like we can be very far behind on the times, whether we want to acknowledge what's happening or not. And then I have students that live in the Northwest or on the East Coast, and they're like, it's Indigenous Peoples holiday. Like, it's Indigenous People Day. Like, that's, and so as an instructor or whatever label they're labeling me for the week, I was like, listen, if you're taking, like, if this is a holiday for you and you're not, you had no intentions on coming to class today, that's completely fine. However, class will still be open because it's not a recognized holiday anyway. And not so much the Indigenous people holiday, but like Columbus Day is not even on our calendar, is what I'm saying.
Yep.
In our public schools, that's what it's labeled as. But I even had to explain to students like the purpose of Indigenous like People's Day in the first place. And I was kind of thrown for a loop because I'm at a tribal college and I'm having to explain to students why this is, because they're witnessing in their own communities people protesting about this. And they
about Indigenous Peoples Day?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And they didn't quite understand it. And it was really interesting because again, there's things that I realize and that I, as someone that lives in Arizona, we can be very progressive in some aspects and then be so far behind. Like, because we're not acknowledging that Indigenous People Day, like there's no acknowledgement really. You know what I mean? Like we see it on social media, but it's not on the media, you know, it's not educating people. It's not anything.
I think Indigenous Peoples Day is a complicated one because it is, you know, it doesn't come out of any actual Indigenous practice,
Right.
right? Like, there's a place where it's like saying, okay, we're finally understanding that Columbus is bad. Columbus is a statue that should be torn down. Columbus sort of, you know, began this cycle of, you know, 500 years of genocide and enslavement for much of the world's population, right? You know, like,
Right.
why do we have a federal holiday for Columbus? Which it's still, you know, I don't know that anywhere is it, like maybe in California, I don't know the details. It is even officially Indigenous Peoples Day. So that is like actually like a whole way of trying to take back and reclaim power. And, you know, and so I'm like completely 100% behind any way that we can reclaim power and, you know, and rename. And, you know, I think that like the next step in that conversation would be like, what day is meaningful to you in your own spiritual or religious tradition, whether it's from an Indigenous perspective or, you know, some other, you know, we do such a bad job in this country of having multiple types of calendars. And, you know, we talked about this last week, which is like, how do we integrate a lunar calendar? How do we integrate a calendar that begins in the morning or begins at sundown? How do we integrate, you know, different types of religious rituals with our sort of 10 days of federal holidays, right? Because, you know,
Yes.
even though one of those federal holidays is Christmas, so there's like already a, you know, a diversity issue. And I come across this myself as a Jewish woman because, you know, I have gotten into, I've had to say pointed things to employers in the past about taking off Yom Kippur, you know, even when they're joking, you know, all those ways that jokes happen, you know, and you're
Right.
like one time there was a boss who asked me, well, what if I told you you couldn't take it off? And I was like, I'd quit, you know, like,
Right.
you
Right.
really gonna like push me there, like around like
Right.
religious freedom, you know, like,
Right. Exactly.
you know, and for your viewers who don't know, Yom Kippur it's like the most holy day in the Jewish year, and like you fast all day and you pray in your synagogue, or this year on your Zoom all year, all day, and you know, it's like kind of, you know, yeah, I mean, like, you just, it's not a day that you like go into work, but like we just in general as an American culture, we don't know how to make space for that. And I think that this gets for me into some of the questions I have about diversity, is if I feel like I'm put up sort of in a corner by, you know, a coworker that says something like that, right? Who else can I look to protect or to ask, right? So like, you know, what accommodations are appropriate? So like making sure, you know, making sure to advocate for, like, if I'm in a school situation, to advocate for kids who are fasting during Ramadan. And, you know, because sometimes that's during the summer, but sometimes that's during final exams. And what kinds of accommodations can we come up with ahead of time so that it's not on the students, or not, you know, to be saying, I need these accommodations, but to say kind of, we have accommodations available if you want to talk to us about it, kind of thing. And so to just use, you know, any of places where I've felt discomfort or like I'm being othered, you know, which we all have, we're all intersectional beings. So we all have those moments where we've been othered in one way or not. Some of us live always in that world, and some of us mostly have the privilege to not feel that way, but we've all had that experience. And how am I making it easier for people who are being othered to step into power? And so it sounds like what you did with Indigenous Peoples Day, which is, again, this like funny thing that's in process of reclaiming power, but at the same time is labeled Columbus Day,
Right.
You know, on federal calendars, right? Like,
Right.
so it's like this funny, like taking power back, but gut punch at the same time.
Yes.
Right? You know, like,
Yes.
how are you making space for your students? And it sounds like you're doing a great job of that, you know, and like just making space and being proactive about your accommodations. And, you know.
It was definitely unique. But it's one of those things as a faculty member that I'm finding whether they want to have these conversations, as long as we're in this digital space of being online, the more, as one of our Autumn professors would say, the more you let into the Autumn like bubble, the more influence, the more cultures, the more you have to be aware of these things. Like we,
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
and the college does, I feel like, an amazing job in making sure that we're not just acknowledging, but actually our calendar is adapted to autumn holidays. And so like our fall break is very early compared to most in the state of Arizona. It's usually the last week of September, because there's a huge pilgrimage that the autumn people do.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, and there's another holiday that Friday before that they also celebrate, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I feel like they do a great job in doing that, but there's still other layers to that as we're like navigating through attendance policies, because we're fighting this like, there's policies and what
Yep.
we have to do because of higher learning commission, but then how do we make sure like the culture, is still there too? And it's really, it's hard,
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
really, really difficult. And then the fact that we have, I believe we're at 54 different tribes
Wow.
in attendance at
Wow.
this college, which is unbelievable,
Wow.
unbelievable. And
Wow.
so we've got people from all over the United States. And it's hard because it's like, I don't know every single culture. It's just not possible for me to know that. But just trying to remind myself, like, this is the culture in which I'm in. And there have been very sticky moments, which we had talked about the last time you and I had talked. Um, and it's been very interesting, which I have a whole nother question. So, a whole other question. It's like,
Go into the question though. I just want to say that that's like, uh, you know, I think that what you described that the college is doing is so important, which is how do you choose which to center? And it is an Autumn college, right? So it's not a pan-native college. It's not a regular community college,
right.
in San Francisco, right? Like, so the fact that it's continuing to center Autumn culture, Autumn holidays, Autumn timing, like that's actually like an incredible invitation in to
Yes.
being in culture. And and that's I think where we in the end get strength. And if you're a visitor in, you can appreciate being in and then choose whether or not that's like something you want to continue being in relationship with. But
Exactly.
but to keep centering it is I think that's just great that they're doing that.
Yes. Yes. One of the conversations that came up in class in child development, we were talking about theories, and the discussion at the very end, there was a student that's like, I don't think we should be talking about these white males that came up with these theories. I think you're choosing to stay ignorant. And that statement was directed towards me, and I was totally fine with it.